Hey guys and girls, in this RGT video we're going to be taking a look at overclocking. Now if you're not sure what actually overclocking is, it's simply the process of running your card faster than it should be. By your card I also mean CPU, memory and so on. My card is the GTX 480. With that said, the procedure to overclock with say an ATI card or a GTX 470 or what have you is pretty much the same thing. You might want to use different software, but either way pretty much everything's going to be very similar, so don't worry about it too much. It will give you, at the very least, this guide will give you a good starting principle of where to begin. Now, before I continue and tell you actually how to do it, let me first of all get my disclaimer out of the way. If you damage your card by doing this, I'm not taking responsibility. Now, I will try to give you a few tips, however, if your PC crashes. First of all, do not choose apply overclocking at system startup. I'm actually using Msi Afterburner, and you can use different applications. However, I find Msi's Afterburner works fine. Bear in mind that it also works with non-MSI cards, so don't worry about it. Now, as I was saying, do not apply overclocking at system startup. If you do, whatever settings you have here will apply automatically as soon as Windows starts, which means that if you have unstable settings, they will conk your system instantly. That's a bad thing, obviously. So before you even think about applying that, make sure that the system is rock stable at those specific settings. Now, if you are having problems and Windows does not load for some reason, first thing I'd suggest doing is try loading in safe mode. If that works, then it's probably something to do with your drivers, so you could quickly uninstall along with maybe Msi Afterburner and then reinstall or something. However, that's all the responsibility I'm taking. In fact, I'm not taking any responsibility, just to make it crystal clear. Now, bear in mind, it's very rare that you have those kind of problems. For the most part, it's fine and dandy to overclock as long as you're sensible. Now, sensible numbers are very different depending on which card you're using. Some cards you can get 10%, some cards you can get 20%, other cards you're not going to be very lucky at all and you'll get 1 to 2%, particularly if they're already pre-overclocked. Now, when I say 10 to 20%, I mean of course on whatever clocks you've already got now. So for example, if I were to put my core clock to 770 MHz, that's obviously a 10% overclock on the core. As a general rule of thumb, on a lot of cards, core clock and shader clocks are linked, and memory clock, shall I say, is independent. On very old cards, they actually were linked, say the Voodoos, but now that's no longer the case. Now, I know what you're going to say. You might say, well, I don't have, say, the cord voltage controls. Okay, if that's the case, click on Settings right here, and you'll notice on the General tab, which is obviously the first one that appears, Unlock voltage controls. I'd also suggest you click Unlock voltage monitoring, just so you can make sure. I would actually recommend that. I don't think there's anything else you particularly need to change here. You can actually record various bits and pieces using this. Just in case you're unaware of it, you can actually record video and images and so on. I don't personally use MSI to do this. I find that the capture quality is not that particularly great on my system, at least. Your mileage, of course, may vary. Anyway, moving on. To overclock, it's simply a case of adjusting the settings. It's that simple. You raise a slider, and obviously the higher the slider goes, the more you've overclocked your card, and so on. As a general rule of thumb, you'll only want to go a few percent at a time at most. So for example, if you're being kind of cautious and sensible, you'll only go to say 715 at a first nudge on my card, for example, and the next one might be say 730, the next one might be 745, 760, and then you'll really want to start maybe going in tens. I personally don't take that approach. I personally go up to, I think I went up to 750 was my first one, and then I think I went to 780 or something, which is generally around the normal numbers that I go for. I'm not advocating that approach, however. I would always recommend caution, particularly if you're new to overclocking. I would recommend 1 to 2% tops. Now, before I get into anything further, Bear in mind that core clock is basically how fast the CPU on the how fast the CPU on the card runs. Now, bear in mind that the CPU is actually called the GPU, Graphics Processing Unit, and is a very specialized type of CPU, specifically built, shall I say, for handling graphics kind of instructions, which are very limited instruction set. You don't have to worry about any of that. All you do have to worry about is it's basically, in charge of processing stuff. So obviously higher the numbers equal the better. Generally speaking, if your shaders do not go up in line with the core clock, you'll have to bump them up manually. Generally speaking, you'll want to put both as high as possible, and you want to keep a roughly even ratio if possible as well. Speaking of which, memory. Memory is basically how fast the RAM on the card runs. Obviously, the faster the better. Now, I'm sure there might be one or two of you out there who might think that overclocking might make a difference to the amount of RAM. Of course, that's not the case. The amount of memory speed you have is simply how fast the data on the card can be hurtled around. If you don't actually have enough RAM on the card to handle the resolution, that's not going to make any difference to you whatsoever. Generally, it might make a tiny bit of difference depending, but generally speaking, not so much, no. Anyway, moving on. There are two enemies for overclocking. The first is voltages, and the second is temperature. Obviously, there are actual physical limits to the hardware, so no amount of, say, cooling and no amount of voltage is going to make my card run at 7 gigahertz. That's just not going to happen. However, generally speaking, if you need to just squeeze a bit more performance out of it, as a rough guide, voltages and temperature are the things. Now, you can raise the voltages at the top. I would always recommend to raise your clock speed first, and then the voltages, to see if that gets you over the hill, so to speak. But I'll get into that in a moment. And finally, temperature. Now, temperature you can control with the fan speed. You simply untick auto, and then we can say raise it up to, let's just say 60, and we click apply, and the fan on your graphics card will automatically start to speed up. You might actually hear the fan, and it can be fairly loud if you go to the higher settings. Some cards obviously are louder than others. Now, as a general rule of thumb, if you're unsure, you should also quickly open up your system and check to see just how much room is in the case and just how many fans and stuff you actually have, especially if it's pre-built. If it is pre-built and you don't actually have enough cooling before you actually overclock, I'd highly suggest that you add in another fan or two. There would be an extra fan in the front. Generally speaking, you want at least one fan in the front to draw in air and push it into the case, and at least one additional fan aside from the power supply fan to draw air out of the rear of the case. I also would suggest, if possible, and your case does support it, you add in a further fan on the side. Personally, I'd also recommend fans at the top and every other place you can possibly get them for good airflow, and also good cable management. Good cable management meaning that you don't have messy cables which are blocking, or shall I say obstructing, the airflow around your case. Now, that's out of the scope of this video, so if you're unsure about cable management, feel free to just click at the very top up there and do a search on case cable management, or even do it in Google, and you'll probably come up with some good guides, generally speaking, involving cable ties and so on. Now, with that said, I'm going to quickly show you how to overclock. Now, technically my card is actually overclocked right now as I'm running at 722 MHz, and I'll do a very light bump on this, and just for the heck of it, I'll also bump this up a little smidge as well. Now, we click apply, and my card is literally overclocked. Now, if I click on the save button, you'll notice 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 at the bottom here light up. These are profiles. All the profile does is quite simply allow you to easily change to different settings. So, for example, if I click on 1, you'll see the sliders change. Click on 3, 4, and finally the one we just saved at 5. Now, when you have settings that you're relatively happy with, so for example, let's say I decided this would be a good starting point to test, you'll need to actually fire up a game or 3D application to make sure that they are actually stable. I would recommend very intensive games, in other words, very demanding 3D games, such as, for example, Crysis 2 or Crysis 1 or what have you. Or you can also use dedicated testing software. Some of it is free. For example, 3D Mark is actually free. Furmark you can also use, and Aquamark, and they'll actually give you a FPS of how well your system is performing, so you can actually kind of see and keep a track of just how much of a difference your overclock is actually making. Generally speaking, it is roughly in line. So obviously, if you've overclocked your processor, so your graphics card, by about 10%, you roughly can expect about 10% extra performance, assuming your CPU is not the bottleneck. Now, I think I've just about covered everything I want to in this video. So if you have any more questions, please feel free to comment and I'll answer them. Now, that's just about everything, I think. So with that all said, take care and goodbye.